In the dim light of a forgotten morning, there is a single stone step half buried in dust. Its surface is smoothed by thousands of bare feet that pressed against it, long before memory learned how to write itself down. Run your thoughts across its cold edge. Feel the silence resting on it, the kind of silence that does not belong to emptiness but to age. This stone has waited. It has held its shape while names turned to ash and shadows learned how to stretch across centuries. You are not here by accident. Something older than curiosity brought you to this moment, an ancient rhythm that moves beneath history rather than through it. Like breath beneath sleep, it carries fragments of memory forward without asking permission. Long before maps, before dates, before the idea of progress itself, this rhythm was already guiding footsteps toward places that were meant to be remembered, even after they vanished. What if civilization is not a straight road leading forward, but a circle traced again and again in dust and stone? What if entire worlds rose, flourished and dissolved into shadow, not as failures, but as necessary turns in a deeper pattern? 9,000 years ago, people lived inside such a circle. They built with care, believed with intensity, and moved in harmony with forces they did not pretend to control. And then quietly they stepped away, leaving only ash-buried walls and questions sealed beneath the earth. This story is not rushing toward an answer. It does not need to. It settles instead into the space between certainty and forgetting, where ancient lives still echo softly. Here time slows, the dust grows heavy, the shadows lengthen. Stone remembers what we no longer can. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper. Night arrives without announcement, settling gently over the land like a held breath finally released. Heat drains slowly from stone and soil, not disappearing but sinking inward, retreating into deeper layers where time moves more carefully. The air cools by degrees so subtle they are felt before they are measured, a quiet instruction to slow down. Dust rests. Shadows lengthen. The surface of the earth prepares itself for listening. This plateau has learned patience. Basalt ribs and limestone shelves release warmth unevenly, creating faint currents that move across the ground like invisible tides. When you stand still, you can feel them brush past your ankles, carrying the memory of sunlight away. Stone prefers night. In darkness, it becomes itself again, no longer asked to reflect, or respond only to exist. Long before walls or words, this land practiced silence. Extinct volcanoes rise on the horizon, their shapes softened not by erosion alone, but by repetition. They have slept longer than any story remembers. Beneath the soil, obsidian waits in thin black seams, glass born from sudden fire, now held in endless restraint. Grasslands spread where forests never claimed dominance, bending in coordinated motion, whispering a language shaped by wind rather than mouths. Listen closely. Traveller and texture becomes time. The ground is compacted, layered by centuries of movement and stillness. Each stratum holds a slightly different resistance underfoot, a different colour, a different density. Soil is history pressed flat. Erosion is time thinking. Gravity is memory insisting on continuity. Above, darkness thickens slowly. Stars do not burst into view, but surface one by one as if emerging from behind a veil. Their cold light maps patterns far older than agriculture, older than settlement, older than fear. The Milky Way stretches faintly across the sky, a pale accumulation of distant fire, reminding the land that it too is only a fragment of a larger rhythm. Night does not erase. It restores. 9,000 years ago, this same darkness arrived in the same way. No artificial glow fractured it. No sharp edges of sound or urgency disturbed the transition. Bodies adjusted instinctively. Breathing slowed. Muscles relaxed. Awareness shifted outward, then inward. Human beings learned to read the atmosphere before they learned to change it. The air carries mineral traces. A dry chalkiness from limestone. A faint metallic note where ancient lava once cooled. When moisture drifts in from distant seas, the scent alters subtly, carrying information about its journey. This knowledge once lived in nerves and lungs, not language. The body understood before the mind tried to explain. Temperature falls another degree. Skin tightens. Blood redistributes quietly, prioritizing warmth near the core. Night reorganizes the body's economy. Movements become deliberate. Thoughts stretch and loosen. Survival simplifies. Warmth, shelter, proximity, rhythm. Civilization begins not with ambition but with synchronized adaptation. The land appears still, yet beneath it tension sleeps. Fault lines hold pressure accumulated over ages. Tectonic plates remember direction even when motion pauses. Stress gathers invisibly grain by grain, year by year, like a sentence composed too slowly to be heard. Silence does not mean absence. It means potential. Imagine this place before edges. No paths worn into habit. No boundaries negotiated. Water moved freely, then pooling in shallow depressions, slipping into hidden channels, resurfacing where stone permitted. Hydrology shaped attention before belief followed. Where water lingered, life lingered. Patterns formed quietly. At night, water cools faster than rock. Springs whisper below the surface, their temperatures steady, indifferent to season. This consistency was an invitation. It drew people closer, generation after generation, until presence became routine. The earth persuades not through force, but through repetition. Ash lies mixed with soil in almost invisible layers. Not catastrophic ash, not the residue of sudden endings, but domestic ash. Hearth ash. The remains of warmth shared and food prepared. Each thin layer marks a night that passed without rupture. Peace leaves the lightest trace. The horizon remains wide and open. No enclosing canopy. No canyon walls to echo sound. The sky is readable here. Movements of light became calendars before calendars existed. Time was tracked by return, not by urgency. What returns can be trusted? The ground balances firmness and give. It holds weight without resisting it. Footprints fade quickly, erased by wind and temperature shifts, yet pressure travels downward, compacting layers, recording presence without image. Even erased steps influence what comes next. Landscapes remember differently than minds do. Insects quiet gradually, one frequency after another. Predators alter their routes. The ecosystem reconfigures itself for night, tuning every process to darkness. Humans once learned to tune themselves as well. Sleep was not escape. It was participation in a larger system. Far below, geology continues without pause. Minerals migrate by fractions. Crystals grow patiently. Water dissolves stone molecule by molecule, uninterested in completion. Erosion does not hurry because it does not doubt. Time here is not anxious. This atmosphere does not impress through drama. Its power lies in steadiness, in the way it holds form across millennia, while human arrangements rise and dissolve like breath on glass. To build here was to borrow stability, never to own it. Night deepens. Temperature stabilizes. The land finishes adjusting. This is the state in which choices were once made, stories formed, and settlements learned where they belonged. Before architecture, before myth, before disappearance. We begin here because everything else rests on this quiet, before evidence accumulates, before anomalies appear, before memory fractures. First, there was atmosphere, and it has never stopped waiting. Night does not rush this place. It lingers just long enough for the land to feel complete within itself. The sky settles into a deeper register, and the stars hold steady, no longer arriving, simply remaining. This constancy is important. It teaches patience without instruction. It tells every living thing that not all motion is progress, and not all stillness is decay. Somewhere beneath the surface, stone cools and contracts by fractions, so small they escape notice, yet these changes matter. Over centuries they decide where cracks will form, where water will travel, where collapse will someday begin. The future is already negotiating with the present quietly without witnesses. Even now the earth is rehearsing what it will become. In this darkness, human presence once felt lighter. Footsteps softened, voices lowered. Fire was guarded carefully, not to dominate the night, but to coexist with it. People understood that darkness was not hostile. It was a condition like gravity or sleep, something to move within rather than against. Fear came later after separation from these rhythms. This atmosphere does not demand belief. It does not ask to be interpreted. It simply exists, holding the memory of those who once breathed in time with it. And as you rest here suspended between attention and surrender, the land recognizes you in the only way it knows how, not by name, by weight, by warmth, by stillness. Evidence does not arrive all at once. It settles. It drifts downward through time like fine dust in still air, layer by layer, grain by grain, until the ground itself becomes a memory thick enough to stand on. At this site, the earth remembers everything, even what the living forgot. Beneath your feet, compressed into silence, are centuries of footsteps, hearth ash, broken bowls, and discarded bones, each one resting exactly where it fell, exactly when it was released from use into history. The soil here is not uniform. A geologist would tell you it reads like a long breath taken by the planet and slowly exhaled. Dark bands of organic material mark years of abundance rich with carbon pollen and microscopic fragments of plant life. Lighter layers signal interruption periods when activity slowed, when something shifted, and the land inhaled dust instead of growth. These layers are not guesses. They are data measured in millimeters, counted like rings inside an ancient tree trunk. Within those layers, fragments begin to speak. Charred grains of wheat and barley preserved by accident in old hearths tell us what people ate and when. The ratios of carbon isotopes locked inside those seeds reveal rainfall patterns, soil stress, even seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest. Nothing here is dramatic. There is no single object that explains everything. Understanding emerges only through patience, through the willingness to listen to small things for a very long time. Stone tools appear, first simple at a glance but precise under study. Obsidian blades, sharp enough to cut skin with gravity alone, trace their origin to volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers away. Each blade carries a geological passport, a chemical signature that ties it to a specific mountain, a specific eruption. Trade then is not speculation. It is etched into the glassy edge of a knife buried beneath a collapsed wall. Bones speak too, but in a quieter dialect. Animal remains show patterns of selective hunting, not desperation. Mature sheep and cattle dominate early layers, their joints cleanly separated, their marrow extracted with restraint. This is not survival scraping at the edge of hunger. This is planning. This is a food system that understands tomorrow. Later layers will change this story, but for now the evidence breathes stability. Human remains are rarer, and when they appear, they are careful. Burials beneath floors, bodies folded gently. Skulls sometimes removed, plastered, repainted, returned. Isotopic analysis of teeth reveals where individuals spent their childhoods, whether they grew up locally or migrated from elsewhere. Most were born here. Few were outsiders. This was not a transient camp. This was a place that held people long enough to shape their bones. The walls themselves preserve fingerprints. Mud brick contains straw reeds, crushed shells, deliberately chosen tempering agents that control cracking as the material dries. Each brick is a small act of engineering. Microscopic wear patterns on floors show repeated paths, habitual movements, the choreography of daily life worn into lime plaster. You can see where people slept, where they cooked, where they paused most often. Space remembers behavior. Pigments on walls are analysed now not as art, but as chemistry. Iron oxides, manganese, charcoal, each ground to specific grain sizes mixed with binders, whose organic traces still cling to mineral surfaces. The murals were not spontaneous. They required preparation, knowledge, repetition. Some pigments were reapplied generation after generation, suggesting images that mattered enough to maintain even as houses were rebuilt over their bones. Pottery arrives later in the sequence, and when it does, it changes slowly. Early vessels are thick, uneven, utilitarian. Then refinement appears. Thinner walls, controlled firing, repeating motifs. Chemical analysis of clay sources shows consistency, suggesting centralized production or shared standards across households. This is coordination without bureaucracy, order, without written law, evidence of agreement rather than command. Fire leaves its own archive. Ash layers differ in composition depending on fuel. Wood ash speaks of forests nearby. Dung ash signals pressure on timber resources and adaptive responses. Changes in combustion temperature visible in microfractures of hearthstones tell us how efficiently energy was managed. Fire here is not chaos. It's a technology tuned to environment. Even waste is eloquent. Midden deposits accumulate slowly, their contents catalogued by species, season and tool marks. Fish bones appear and disappear, tracking shifts in river flow. Insect remains reveal storage practices where the grain was sealed tightly or left vulnerable. Parasite eggs found in soil samples whisper about sanitation and crowding. The civilization leaves behind its unintended autobiography. There is no written language in these layers, no tablets declaring purpose or identity. And yet the dust coheres. Patterns repeat across centuries. Building dimensions stabilize. Tool forms persist. Burial positions remain consistent. This continuity is evidence of memory operating without ink tradition transmitted through bodies and hands rather than symbols. Time itself becomes visible. Radiocarbon dates cluster tightly overlapping across structures, confirming that houses were not abandoned randomly, but rebuilt deliberately aligned with previous foundations. The city does not sprawl outward. It rises upward, layering itself vertically like a thought refined rather than expanded. This choice alone contradicts most assumptions about early urban growth. What matters most is not any single measurement, but convergence. Soil chemistry agrees with pollen data. Tool sourcing aligns with trade patterns implied by shell ornaments. Architectural wear matches isotopic evidence of population stability. Independent lines of inquiry converge on the same conclusion. This place was not accidental, it was maintained. Evidence in the end is not loud, it does not argue, it accumulates until doubt grows tired. Each fragment carries uncertainty, but together they form a pressure slow and constant, like sediment compressing into stone. You do not need belief to accept this story, you only need patience, and patience is what the Earth has always had. There is another kind of evidence that does not appear in charts or isotope ratios, but it is no less real. It lives in absence. In the places where nothing was built, where no debris accumulated, where the soil remains strangely untouched. These gaps outline intention. They suggest boundaries that were respected spaces left open, not by accident but by agreement. Silence here is structured. There is wind-blown dust trapped between occupation layers reveals pauses in activity, moments when construction stopped and the ground rested. These were not collapses, they were breaths. Seasons when the city waited, when labour slowed, when people turned inward. Even rest leaves a trace, a thin film of particles settling on abandoned floors before life resumed again. The evidence also survives in repetition. Generations rebuilding houses in the same footprints, aligning walls with older walls buried beneath, choosing continuity over novelty. This is not technological stagnation. It is memory refusing to erode. Gravity presses downward, but tradition presses back. And so the record holds. Not as a declaration, but as a quiet accumulation of choices made over centuries. The Earth keeps them all compressed, patient, unarguable. At first, nothing seems wrong. The data aligns, the layers stack neatly. The dates agree with one another within margins that make scientists comfortable. This is how the Earth usually speaks calmly, cooperatively, willing to be understood. But anomalies do not announce themselves as contradictions. They appear as small discomforts in an otherwise coherent story, like a stone in a shoe during a long walk. The first anomaly is architectural. Cities as we understand them grow outward. They sprawl, extend, fracture into districts. This one did not. Instead of expanding across the plain, it grew upward, house upon house, wall upon wall, each generation building directly on top of the last. This was not forced by geography. There was open land all around. The choice to stack life vertically was deliberate, repeated, maintained for centuries. Then there are the entrances, or rather the absence of them. No streets, no doors at ground level, no visible thresholds where private life met public space. People entered their homes from above, descending through roof openings, as if returning to the earth rather than leaving it. This design resists every model of efficiency we project backward. It slows movement, it complicates transport, and yet it persisted unchanged. Defensive explanations fail under scrutiny. There is no evidence of constant warfare, no fortifications, no mass trauma in early layers. If fear drove this design, It left no skeletal trace. Social explanations struggle too. Privacy would have been minimal, smoke would have lingered, movement would have required coordination. And yet population density increased, not decreased. People stayed. Another anomaly rests in ritual intensity. Burials beneath floors are not unusual on their own, but the consistency is striking. Ancestors were not relegated to margins. They were placed directly beneath living spaces, beneath sleeping mats and hearths. In some cases, skulls were removed, plastered, painted, then reintegrated into walls or platforms. The dead did not leave. They were structurally embedded. This is not symbolic excess. It is logistical commitment. Removing skulls requires time-care repetition. Replastering walls around them requires coordination. These acts were normalized, not exceptional. The anomaly is not that they did this, but that they did it everywhere for so long without apparent deviation. The art introduces further tension. Murals depict animals out of scale, figures without faces, repeated geometric forms that do not evolve stylistically over centuries. Most artistic traditions drift. Motifs mutate. Here repetition dominates. Certain symbols recur with such fidelity that they appear almost regulated, yet there is no evidence of centralized authority enforcing them. And then there is the question of surplus. The material record shows prosperity. Trade networks extended hundreds of kilometers. Craft specialization increased. Yet wealth accumulation appears muted. Grave goods vary, but not dramatically. No palaces, no elite districts, no obvious ruling class. Complexity without hierarchy is an anomaly our models are not built to handle. Technological anomalies surface as well. Some stone tools exhibit polish and symmetry exceeding what is functionally necessary. Axes too refined to fell trees. Blades too delicate for heavy use. These objects were made to exist, not to work. Time was invested where survival did not require it. Energy flowed into meaning rather than efficiency. Environmental data adds quiet dissonance. The climate during much of this period was stable, favorable. There was no immediate pressure forcing radical adaptation. And yet architectural and social choices suggest anticipation, not reaction. As if the people were preparing for something not yet visible, as if memory extended forward. Population density presents another puzzle. Tens of thousands of people lived in close quarters, without the sanitation systems we associate with urban resilience. Parasite loads remain relatively low in early phases. Disease does not spike until much later. This implies behavioral norms that limited transmission practices invisible archaeologically, but effective biologically. Time itself behaves strangely here. Radiocarbon dates compress. Centuries blur. Change arrives slowly, almost reluctantly, and then much later everything accelerates. The anomaly is not collapse, it is stability. 1,000 years of sustained coherence without writing, without kings, without apparent coercion. Most archaeological anomalies are moments of excess or absence. This one is different. It is a pattern that should not hold, yet does. A civilization that contradicts our assumptions not by failing, but by working too well under conditions we believe insufficient. The anomaly deepens when we consider what is missing. No monuments announcing power, no inscriptions claiming permanence, no myth carved in stone declaring dominance over nature. Instead, walls were replastered, repeatedly erasing old surfaces, renewing them. Memory here was cyclical, not accumulative. Even waste patterns resist expectation. Valuable materials were deliberately broken and buried, tools smashed, objects sealed inside walls where retrieval was impossible. From a utilitarian perspective, this is irrational. From a ritual perspective, it is precise. But ritual usually coexists with display. Here, concealment dominates. The deeper you look, the less the anomaly feels like error and more like intention. Not ignorance, but refusal. A society choosing to organize itself around principles we have since abandoned. Principles that prioritize continuity over expansion, integration, over visibility depth, over reach. This is uncomfortable evidence. It resists simplification. It does not fit neatly into narratives of progress. It asks questions without offering replacements. and so for decades it was minimized, explained away, reframed as transitional, experimental, incomplete. But anomalies are not mistakes in data. They are invitations to rethink the frame itself. When evidence refuses to comply, it is often the theory that needs revision, not the past. The anomaly then is not what they built. It is how completely their way of being disappears from our historical imagination, as if the earth preserved their remains but not their logic. And logic, like sediment, can erode, slowly, silently. There is a final anomaly that emerges only when everything else is placed side by side and allowed to rest. It is the emotional temperature of the evidence. Most ancient sites carry traces of urgency, fear, conquest, or assertion. Here those signals are muted. The material record feels calm, not passive, but settled. Tools were replaced without haste. Homes were rebuilt without expansion. Death was folded gently into daily life rather than pushed away. This calm is not naivete, it is discipline. Maintaining such coherence across centuries requires restraint stronger than ambition. It suggests a collective agreement about limits, about how far growth should go, about when enough was enough. That agreement leaves no monument, no law, no inscription. It survives only as balance. From a modern perspective, this is deeply unsettling. We are trained to see complexity as unstable, without control, density as dangerous without hierarchy. Yet here is a counterexample written into the ground itself, a society that chose proximity without dominance, memory without permanence, meaning without expansion. The anomaly in the end is not technological or architectural, it is philosophical, a way of inhabiting time that does not aim forward but inward, a civilization that behaved as if it knew something we would later forget. And forgetting too leaves a trace. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything that chose not to speak. In the archaeological records, silence appears as gaps where continuity should exist, as pauses where momentum once flowed. At this site, silence settles between layers like a held breath, a moment stretched across centuries. There are things the earth preserved carefully and things it allowed to fade, and the distinction between the two is where meaning begins to thin. There is no written language here, no marks that translate thought directly into symbol. No tablets pressed with declarations, no walls carved with names meant to endure. For a civilization that lasted over 1,000 years, this absence is profound. Writing is not inevitable. It is a choice. And here that choice was never made, or perhaps it was deliberately refused. Memory was entrusted to bodies, not surfaces. What survives instead is repetition. Houses rebuilt in the same places. Rituals performed in the same configurations, art motifs returned to again and again without explanation. This kind of memory does not record events, it preserves patterns. It does not say what happened, it says how things are done. Silence in this sense is procedural rather than empty. Between occupation layers there are moments where activity slows so much it almost disappears. Thin lenses of wind-blown dust settle on floors that were once swept daily. Hearths go cold long enough for insects to leave their quiet signatures. These are not catastrophes, they are intervals. The city does not fall silent abruptly, it fades. Resumes, then fades again like a tide hesitating before turning. The silence is also social. There are no visible markers of individual distinction, no houses larger than others by meaningful margins, no graves that demand attention through excess. Even when wealth exists, it is dispersed, diffused into objects that circulate rather than accumulate. Power, if it existed, chose not to leave a recognizable shape. This absence unsettles modern expectations. We look for leaders, hierarchies, moments of declaration. We expect silence to signal loss or ignorance. But silence can also signal sufficiency. When systems function smoothly, they do not narrate themselves. They repeat. They endure quietly until something disrupts them. Children grow up here without inscriptions telling them who they are. Identity is transmitted through proximity, through shared movement, through the constant presence of ancestors beneath the floor. The dead do not speak in words, they speak in placement. Their silence is architectural. It shapes how the living walk, sleep and remember. There is silence in the art as well. Figures without faces, animals without clear context, scenes that refuse interpretation. These images are not puzzles waiting to be solved. They are boundaries. They mark the edge of what was meant to be explained. Meaning did not require articulation. It required repetition and restraint. The silence extends into the wider region. When this civilization ends, it does not announce its departure. There is no clear migration trail, no sudden appearance of identical material culture elsewhere. The people do not re-emerge under new names. They disperse into anonymity, leaving behind techniques and habits that surface later without attribution. Silence becomes inheritance. Archaeologists search these gaps with increasing sophistication. Ground-penetrating radar microbotanical analysis, isotopic mapping. Each tool illuminates something, but none restore the voices that were never recorded. Technology can recover process, but not intention. Silence resists excavation. There is a temptation to fill these gaps with speculation to project myths where none were written. But silence demands a different posture. It asks for patience. It asks us to sit with uncertainty without trying to resolve it. In geology, gaps are often the most informative features. Unconformities reveal forces larger than deposition alone. The silence here may reflect trust. Trust that memory would be carried forward without inscription. Trust that continuity did not need explanation. Trust that disappearance did not equal failure. A civilization confident enough not to describe itself may also be one prepared to let go. As the city contracts in its later phases, silence grows heavier. Public buildings fall out of use. Ritual spaces shrink. Burials become simpler, not abruptly, gradually. The record does not scream, it exhales. The people who lived through this likely did not know they were approaching an end. Silence rarely feels dramatic from the inside. Night after night, fires burned lower. Songs shortened. Paths went unused. These moments leave almost no trace, yet they define the transition more clearly than any destruction layer could. Collapse here is not loud. It is quiet enough to be mistaken for sleep, and perhaps that is the most unsettling silence of all. The possibility that endings do not always arrive as events, that they can unfold as absences accumulating until presence becomes memory. The ground holds this silence carefully, not as a void, but as a record of restraint. In the end, what we encounter here is not ignorance, but refusal. A civilization that chose not to speak in ways we expect, that trusted silence as a medium of continuity, that allowed disappearance to occur without announcement. Silence, like sediment, settles slowly, and once it does, it is difficult to disturb. Silence also exists in what was never corrected. When walls cracked, they were replastered rather than replaced. When floors sagged, they were levelled gently, not torn out. Maintenance here did not aim for perfection, only continuity. The absence of innovation in response to minor failure suggests a culture comfortable with impermanence, one that did not mistake repair for progress. This restraint leaves little drama for history to record. There is no evidence of panic during decline, no hoarded food sealed away in desperation, no sudden shift toward monumental building meant to anchor memory against loss. Instead, the city simplifies. Fewer rooms are maintained, fewer rituals leave traces. Life contracts inward, quietly conserving energy. Silence thickens not as fear, but as focus. The dead continue to be buried beneath the living even as population thins. This persistence matters. It suggests that meaning did not erode alongside resources. Belief did not collapse when abundance did. The symbolic relationship between past and present remained intact until the very end. Silence did not signal abandonment of values. It protected them. Outside the settlement, vegetation begins to reclaim space. Pollen records show grass is returning where fields once dominated. Shrubs spread cautiously. The land responds not with violence but with opportunity. Nature does not mourn cities. It absorbs them. This too is a kind of silence, indifferent and complete. For those who remained, the quiet must have felt familiar. Fewer voices, yes, but the same rhythms, the same night sky, the same stones cooling after sunset. Departure would not have felt like loss at first. It would have felt like thinning, like space opening slowly around what remained. Silence then becomes the final architecture. Not walls or roofs, but intervals, pauses between footsteps, empty rooms that still hold warmth. Paths remembered even when unused. This is the silence the earth keeps best. Not the silence of erasure, but the silence of completion. And within that silence the civilization does not vanish. It dissolves, gradually, gently, leaving behind not answers but space enough for us to listen. There was a time when this place did not feel ancient at all, when walls were bright with fresh plaster and hands still carried warmth as they passed bowls from one body to another. The forgotten epoch is not a shadowy prelude or a fading aftermath. It is a full world dense with routine texture and expectation. To forget it now is not a failure of memory, but a consequence of how completely it once functioned. Morning began without clocks. Light entered from above, spilling down through roof openings in soft-angled sheets. Dust motes drifted, slowly suspended like thought before language. Bodies woke together not by command, but by rhythm. Fire was coaxed back to life from embers saved through the night. Stone absorbed the sound of movement, keeping voices close intimate. This was not a world of grand moments. It was a world of accumulation. Each day added almost nothing, and yet over generations everything changed. Children learned paths before they learned words. They learned where not to step, where smoke pooled, where ancestors rested beneath the floor. Memory was spatial. Knowledge lived in muscle, and habit passed without instruction. Outside the landscape offered abundance without excess. Fields were worked carefully, not aggressively. Crops rotated, soil was given time to recover. Herds were managed with restraint. Hunting supplemented rather than replaced agriculture. This balance did not arise from theory. It emerged from observation repeated across lifetimes. The land taught and people listened. Time moved differently here. Seasons mattered more than years. Cycles mattered more than progress. The future was not imagined as improvement, but as continuation. Children were not expected to surpass their elders, only to carry what worked forward intact. Innovation existed, but it was quiet, absorbed, slowly tested across decades before becoming tradition. Art was everywhere, but rarely separated from function. Walls were painted not to be seen by strangers, but to accompany daily life. Figures watched from familiar angles. Symbols repeated until they felt inevitable. Meaning was not explained. It was lived with until explanation felt unnecessary. Religion, if that word applies, was not centralized. There were no temples rising above the rest. Sacredness was distributed. Every house carried it. Every burial reinforced it. The boundary between ritual and routine was thin enough to dissolve entirely. Cooking, sleeping, remembering all participated in the same system of meaning. This epoch did not record itself because it did not need to. It did not imagine an audience beyond itself. The people here did not act as if they were laying foundations for the future. They acted as if the present was sufficient. That sufficiency is what makes this time so difficult to reconstruct. Contentment leaves few traces. Children grew into adults who expected the world to remain legible. The same paths, the same stars, the same soil. This expectation was not naive. It was reasonable based on generations of consistency. Stability was not an illusion yet. It was an experience reinforced daily. The city's density created intimacy rather than anonymity. Proximity demanded awareness. Conflict could not be ignored, but neither could cooperation. Social bonds were maintained through constant negotiation rather than formal authority. Reputation mattered more than rule. Memory replaced law. Even death participated in continuity. The dead were returned to the house, placed beneath floors, integrated rather than removed. Grief unfolded in familiar spaces. Loss did not require departure. It required adjustment. The living adapted around absence the same way they adapted around walls and hearths. This forgotten epoch was not primitive. It was refined through repetition. Its sophistication lay not in expansion but in calibration. energy was invested where it mattered most. Waste was minimized not by ideology, but by habit. Resources were respected because disrespect had immediate consequences. As centuries passed, subtle changes accumulated. Tools became more precise, art more standardized, trade networks wider, yet the core structure held. Houses were rebuilt in the same shapes. Rituals repeated with minor variation. The past remained present not as nostalgia but as infrastructure. From a distance of 9 millennia, this period collapses into a blur. But lived from within, it stretched long and deep. Generations expected to die where they were born. The idea of departure did not dominate imagination. The world felt whole enough to remain. This is the epoch we struggle to see because it contradicts our narrative instincts. We look for origins and endings. This time offers neither. It is a middle without drama, a sustained equilibrium. Its disappearance feels tragic only because we assume permanence should be rewarded, but nothing here was built to last forever. It was built to last long enough to raise children, long enough to remember ancestors, long enough to feel the land respond predictably. The forgotten epoch did not fail. It completed its purpose. When it began to thin, when pressures accumulated beyond its adaptive range, there was no script for crisis. People adjusted as they always had, incrementally. Only later would those adjustments reveal themselves as signs of ending. From within, it likely felt like continuity under strain, not collapse. The tragedy, if there is one, is not that this epoch vanished. It is that its logic did not survive in recognizable form. We inherit fragments without context, techniques without philosophy, evidence without atmosphere, and so we label it lost. But lost is a misleading word. This epoch is not gone, it is buried. Pressed into layers of earth and habit and unconscious inheritance. It waits beneath our timelines, patient, unarguable. The forgotten epoch was not forgotten by the earth, only by us. As this epoch deepened, knowledge moved without ceremony. Skills passed from hand to hand, not from voice to archive. A child learned by watching shadows shift across walls, by noticing which stones stayed warm longest, by sensing when a fire needed feeding before smoke began to sting the eyes. Education was not a phase of life, it was the atmosphere of it. Seasonal change arrived gently. No single storm defined a year. No single harvest determined survival. The land responded gradually and people adjusted, in return refining practices rather than abandoning them. When yields dipped, labour redistributed. When herds grew too large, they were thinned. Balance was not idealised. It was enforced quietly by consequence. This epoch also held boredom, though we rarely imagine it. Long afternoons, repeated tasks, familiar conversations. This matters because boredom is stability made visible. Only when survival is secured does repetition become possible. Only when danger recedes can the mind wander. In those wanderings, art emerged not as escape, but as companion. Stories were told without concern for preservation. What mattered was not accuracy, but resonance. A story that worked survived, one that did not faded naturally. Memory was selective, guided by usefulness rather than fidelity. This made tradition resilient, capable of adapting without fracture. As generations overlapped, the sense of time thickened. Elders remembered their grandparents. Children grew up surrounded by multiple layers of lived experience. The past was not distant. It was underfoot, literally and figuratively. This density of memory created orientation. People knew where they stood. When the forgotten epoch finally began to loosen its grip, it did so without protest. There was no betrayal, only transition. The structures that had held life so well began slowly to release it, and because release was gradual, it did not feel like loss. This is what makes the epoch hardest to recover. It left no scar, only sediment. The earth does not destroy out of anger, it resets out of necessity. What appears to us as collapse is often the planet exhaling, after holding a system in balance for as long as it could. In deep time, endings are rarely punishments. They are recalibrations. This is where the story shifts not into catastrophe, but into adjustment so slow that those living through it would not have recognized its full shape. The reset begins quietly. It always does. A change in rainfall that is almost imperceptible at first. A season that arrives slightly earlier than expected. A river that floods a little higher one year and runs a little lower the next. These are not alarms, they are murmurs. The earth speaks in gradients, not commands, and civilizations accustomed to stability often hear these changes as noise rather than signal. Soil responds before people do. Nutrients thin. Organic matter decomposes faster than it can be replaced. Fields still produce, but yields become inconsistent. One harvest is generous, the next barely adequate. This is not failure. It is variability, the first sign that equilibrium is loosening its grip. Agriculture, more than any other human system, is exquisitely sensitive to small shifts in climate. The people adapt because adaptation is what they know. Storage pits deepen, granaries expand. New fields are carved into marginal land. Hillsides are terraced to capture what water remains. Labour increases not in bursts of desperation, but as a steady escalation of effort. Workdays lengthen, margins shrink. The system still functions, but it requires more energy to maintain the same result. This is the hidden cost of resilience. Each adaptation solves an immediate problem while tightening the system's dependency on conditions that no longer reliably exist. The civilization becomes efficient at surviving yesterday's climate even as today's conditions quietly move away from it. The reset does not arrive as an event. It arrives as fatigue. Water systems strain next. Springs fluctuate. Channels silt more quickly. Wells must be dug deeper. Each intervention pulls resources from elsewhere. Time spent maintaining irrigation is time not spent on ritual repair or rest. The balance between material survival and cultural continuity begins to tilt, not abruptly but persistently. Forests retreat under combined pressure. Timber is needed for construction fuel and increasingly for metalworking as copper use expands. Trees are not just resources, they are stabilizers. Their removal accelerates erosion, strips soil of cohesion, alters local rainfall patterns. Deforestation is never isolated, it cascades. Animal populations respond immediately. Overgrazing compacts soil, reduces regrowth, shifts plant communities toward hardier but less nutritious species. Herds still exist, but they require more land for less return. Wild game thins. Hunting becomes less selective. The evidence records this transition with unsettling clarity. Younger animals, smaller species, bones cracked more thoroughly for marrow. This is not ignorance. It is necessity. The reset tightens options. Climate variability amplifies everything. Drought years follow flood years with little warning. Fields that survive one extreme fail under the next. Predictability erodes, and with it the confidence that planning once relied upon. Knowledge inherited from elders becomes less reliable, not because it was wrong, but because the conditions that made it effective no longer hold. Social systems feel this pressure next. Cooperation frays when scarcity introduces competition. Storage facilities are reinforced, homes are modified to secure food. Defensive structures appear where none were needed before. Violence once rare leaves faint but unmistakable marks on bone. These are not wars of conquest. They are conflicts of stress, trade networks, contract. Long-distance exchange becomes risky when local needs dominate attention. Exotic materials disappear from later layers. Craft specialization declines as survival reasserts itself as the primary occupation. Objects become cruder, not through loss of skill, but through reallocation of time and energy. Ritual simplifies. Elaborate ceremonies give way to abbreviated forms. Temples are dismantled, their stones reused for fortifications. Sacred architecture is not abandoned out of disbelief, but out of urgency. When system strain symbolism becomes negotiable, survival does not wait. And yet the reset is not total erasure. Even as complexity recedes, identity persists. Pottery styles remain recognizable. Burial practices continue though reduced. People still mark their dead. They still orient themselves by familiar stars. Meaning does not vanish, it compresses. At some point the cost of maintaining the settlement outweighs the benefit of staying. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It emerges gradually, household by household. Peripheral areas are abandoned first. The occupied footprint shrinks. The city inhales, retreating toward its core like a body conserving heat. Children grow up in a smaller world than their parents knew. Fewer neighbours, fewer rituals, fewer shared spaces. To them, this is normal. Collapse feels different depending on where you stand within it. For the last generation, it may not have felt like collapse at all, but like a quieter version of life. The final reset arrives without spectacle. No fire, no final battle, no dramatic destruction layer. People leave, they take what they can carry and abandon what they cannot. The ground is left intact, almost respectful, as if the earth is absorbing the settlement rather than consuming it. This is how the reset completes itself, not as an ending, but as a release. Pressure dissipates, human presence thins, vegetation returns, water finds new paths. The land begins another long adjustment indifferent to memory yet shaped by it. From a geological perspective, this reset is brief, a blink. From a human perspective, it spans generations of adaptation effort and quiet loss. The earth does not hurry, it does not mourn, it recalibrates. What was built returns to sediment. What was learned seeps outward, carried by survivors into other regions, other cultures, other futures. The civilization does not die. It dissolves redistributed into the broader human story. Reset is not failure. It is the earth restoring balance after accommodation has reached its limit. A breath out after a long, careful holding in. And in deep time, breathing is everything. What remains after the reset is not emptiness, but redistribution. People do not vanish into nothing. They move, fragment, merge, adapt. Small groups carry habits forward without knowing they are doing so. A way of stacking stone. A preference for certain crop rotations. A rhythm of work and rest that once fit a different land. These fragments survive because they are practical, not because they are remembered. For the earth, this dispersal is efficient. Pressure releases across a wider area. Human density thins. Vegetation recovers incrementally. Soils stabilize. Rivers settle into new channels shaped partly by abandoned infrastructure. The planet absorbs what was built and repurposes it without ceremony. Reset is not destruction. It is rebalancing. For the people who left the reset likely felt ambiguous. Relief mixed with loss. Freedom mixed with disorientation. Leaving behind ancestors buried beneath floors would not have been easy. That separation alone marks a profound shift in worldview. Memory once anchored to place had to become portable. Identity had to loosen. And yet this flexibility is what allows survival beyond collapse. Systems that can dissolve gracefully leave fewer scars. They do not resist change until rupture. They yield, gradually preserving life rather than structure. In this way, the reset reveals a final intelligence embedded in the civilization itself. Not an intelligence of prediction, an intelligence of release. Long after the last roof collapsed inward and the last hearth cooled into ash, the civilization did not truly end. It lingered not as memory, but as resonance. Like a sound that continues after its source has gone silent, the echo of this world travelled forward through time, slipping quietly into bodies, habits, and landscapes that no longer remembered its origin. Echoes do not preserve form, they preserve rhythm, a way of arranging space, a preference for proximity, a tendency toward repetition rather than expansion. These patterns reappear later in places far removed from their source, not as copies, but as intuitions. Builders who never heard of this city stack walls in familiar proportions. Farmers rotate crops in ways that feel obvious without knowing why. Memory moves underground. Some echoes live in the body. Genetic studies reveal subtle continuities, faint signals of population movement rather than disappearance. These people did not vanish. They thinned, dispersed, merged. Their descendants carried fragments of adaptation encoded not as stories but as tolerance. Tolerance for crowding, for long-term cooperation, for shared resources managed without overt control. These traits persist because they worked. Architecture carries its own echo. In later settlements across the region, houses cluster tightly. Courtyards disappear. Roofs become active spaces. Entryways elevate. No direct lineage can be proven, yet the solutions rhyme. When faced with similar constraints, human minds rediscover familiar answers. The echo guides without instruction. Ritual echoes linger as well. The practice of burying the dead beneath living spaces fades, but ancestor veneration does not. It relocates. Graves cluster near homes. Ritual objects appear in domestic contexts rather than centralized temples. The sacred remains distributed. This dispersal mirrors an older logic, one that resisted concentration of meaning in a single place. Even silence echoes. Later cultures inherit a reluctance to monumentalize power. For centuries, settlements rise without kings, without inscriptions declaring dominance. Authority remains local, negotiated, personal. These societies are often labeled simple, but simplicity can be a sophisticated inheritance. Echoes are often mistaken for absence. The land itself participates in memory. Soil altered by centuries of cultivation retains fertility patterns that shape future use. Old channels guide new water. Subtle depressions influence where later people settle without knowing why. Geography remembers even when history does not. Language too carries ghosts. Words for home, hearth, earth, ancestor share roots across regions, hinting at shared conceptual frameworks, older than recorded speech. Meaning survives where vocabulary shifts. An echo does not repeat sound exactly. It distorts it just enough to fit new spaces. The echo also carries warning. Later societies unconsciously replicate both strengths and vulnerabilities. Dense settlement, intensive agriculture, reliance on stable climate. These patterns return because they once worked. But the conditions that supported them do not always return with equal generosity. Echoes do not discriminate between success and limitation. What makes the echo powerful is its invisibility. No one chooses it. It moves beneath intention, beneath awareness. It shapes decisions that feel natural, inevitable, self-evident. This is how deep time communicates, not through instruction, but through recurrence. From our vantage point, the echo feels uncanny. We recognize ourselves in people separated by 9 millennia. Their questions, their adjustments, their quiet optimism that systems built carefully will hold. This recognition is not coincidence, it is inheritance without acknowledgement. The echo reminds us that civilizations do not transmit themselves only through monuments or texts. They transmit through solved problems, through solutions that outlive their creators because they continue to function. These are the most durable artifacts of all. And yet echoes fade. Each repetition loses clarity. Context erodes. Eventually what remains is instinct without explanation, pattern without awareness. At that point, the echo becomes background noise influencing without being heard. This is where we stand now, surrounded by echoes we cannot trace, living inside solutions whose origins we have forgotten, repeating choices that once made sense under different skies. The lost civilization speaks to us not through ruins, but through resonance, through the quiet familiarity of its logic returning in our own structures, our own tensions, our own hopes. The echo does not ask to be remembered. It asks only to be recognized. And recognition, like sound, travels further when the night is still. The echo deepens when we pay attention to what feels natural. Modern people often speak of certain social arrangements as intuitive, as if cooperation, shared labor, or communal space arise spontaneously rather than historically. But intuition is rarely innate. It is learned slowly across generations until it sinks below awareness. What feels obvious is often inherited. The echo lives precisely there in assumptions that do not announce themselves. Consider the recurring human impulse to build inward rather than outward during periods of uncertainty, to compress rather than expand, to share walls, share heat, share risk. This instinct resurfaces again and again in different eras under different names. It is framed as efficiency, as security, as sustainability. But beneath those rationalizations lies something older, a remembered solution to pressure. The echo does not explain itself. It simply returns when needed. Even our relationship to rest carries traces. The idea that sleep is not wasted time, but a necessary alignment with larger cycles, appears and disappears throughout history. Societies that ignore it burn quickly. Societies that honour it last longer. This understanding was once embedded in daily life, not treated as a personal failing or luxury. The echo remains faint but persistent, resurfacing whenever exhaustion becomes collective. There are echoes in how we respond to collapse as well. Some cultures meet decline with denial and acceleration, clinging to growth as if it were protection. Others slow down, they simplify, they let complexity shed itself in layers. This second response is rarer, harder to notice, and often misunderstood as regression. But it is also an echo of an older intelligence, one that recognized when holding on caused more harm than letting go. The echo carries grief differently too, not as a rupture but as integration. Loss becomes something to live with rather than something to overcome. This posture surfaces in moments when people choose memorial over monument, remembrance over conquest. These choices feel ethical, but they are also practical. They reduce pressure. They conserve energy. They allow continuity without illusion. What makes the echo unsettling is that it undermines the idea of uniqueness. We like to believe our solutions are new, our challenges unprecedented. The echo suggests otherwise. It implies that many of our current dilemmas have been navigated before under quieter skies, with fewer tools but deeper patience. This does not diminish us, it situates us. Listening for the echo requires stillness. It requires resisting the urge to label or claim. Echoes cannot be owned. They cannot be branded or traced cleanly. They pass through us, briefly shaping decisions before moving on. To notice them is not to master them, but to acknowledge participation in a much longer conversation. The lost civilization does not reach forward to instruct us. It resonates because we are tuned to similar frequencies again. Dense populations, climate stress, resource strain, questions about how much complexity can be sustained without fracture. The echo grows louder when conditions align, and perhaps that is its final function, not to warn exactly, but to remind us that we are not the first to face these pressures, and that survival has never depended solely on innovation or force. It has depended on timing restraint and the willingness to adjust before breaking. The echo fades only when ignored completely. Otherwise it remains low and steady, vibrating beneath the noise of modern life, waiting for moments of quiet, waiting for recognition. The pattern does not announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, the way frost spreads across stone before dawn, invisible until it has already changed the surface. At first history appears linear, a forward march from ignorance to knowledge, from simplicity to complexity, from small fires to bright cities. That is how it is taught, how it is drawn on timelines and museum walls. But when you sit with the evidence long enough, when you let the dust settle and the noise fade, another shape begins to emerge. Not a line, but a curve, not progress, but rhythm. Geologists know this instinctively. No mountain rises forever. No river deepens without also shifting its course. Pressure builds, release follows, and the land exhales. Civilizations behave in much the same way. They gather energy, organize matter, concentrate people and ideas into dense arrangements, and for a time this concentration creates brilliance. Art sharpens, knowledge accelerates, systems interlock, and then almost imperceptibly strain begins to accumulate in the joints. The pattern begins with abundance. Favorable climate, fertile soil, stable seasons. These conditions allow people to stay. Staying leads to memory, and memory leads to structure. Structures invite specialization. Specialization increases efficiency. Efficiency feeds growth. Growth demands coordination. Coordination creates hierarchy, whether acknowledged or not. This sequence repeats across continents and millennia, as predictable as sediment settling in a quiet basin. It is not a failure of imagination. It is gravity at work in human systems. What follows abundance is not collapse but tightening. The margins narrow. Surpluses shrink. Systems that once absorbed shock now transmit it. A dry year no longer means hunger for a few but stress for thousands. A broken trade route is no longer an inconvenience but a fracture. The pattern does not punish success. It tests it. It asks whether complexity can bend without snapping, whether identity can survive contraction. Archaeological layers record this question in silence. You see it in thinner walls built atop thicker ones, in reused stones, in pottery that favours speed over beauty, in burial practices that become simpler, not because belief has vanished, but because energy has. The pattern does not erase culture immediately. It erodes its excess first. Ornament goes before function. Ceremony contracts before survival. Meaning is compressed, not abandoned. This is where the myth of linear progress breaks down completely. If history were a straight line, knowledge would accumulate without loss. But the ground tells a different story. Techniques disappear. Skills are forgotten. Entire ways of organizing life dissolve, leaving only fragments embedded in later traditions. This is not because people become less intelligent. It is because knowledge requires maintenance. Without the social and environmental conditions that support it, even the most sophisticated understanding fades like exposed pigment under sun and rain. The pattern is cyclical, but not repetitive in a simple sense. Each turn of the cycle is shaped by what came before. The past leaves grooves. When pressure builds again, it flows along familiar channels. This is why certain architectural forms reappear in different eras, why communal living resurfaces during periods of scarcity, why societies rediscover old agricultural practices when industrial systems falter. These are not revivals out of nostalgia. They are reactivations of dormant solutions. Sleep itself follows the pattern. Wakefulness expands during times of abundance. Nights grow shorter, work stretches, light pushes back darkness. Then exhaustion accumulates. Bodies fail, minds fracture. Cultures that survive are those that relearn rest as alignment rather than indulgence. Sleep becomes a ritual again, not an afterthought. The pattern insists on pause whether welcomed or not. From orbit, Earth's surface tells the same story. Forests advance, retreat, advance again. Ice sheets grow, collapse, regrow. The planet does not aim for permanence, it aims for balance through motion. Human societies embedded within this system cannot escape its logic. When they attempt to override it, when they demand endless expansion from finite ground, the pattern tightens its grip. Correction follows. The lost civilization fits perfectly within this arc. Its rise was not miraculous. It was timely. Its disappearance was not mysterious. It was systemic. Climate shifted. Resources strained. Complexity exceeded resilience. The pattern did not single them out. It simply passed through them as it has through countless others whose names we no longer know. Their uniqueness lies not in their fate, but in how clearly their layers reveal the cycle. Modern observers often resist this interpretation. Cycles feel threatening. They undermine the promise that tomorrow will always be bigger, faster, more advanced than today. But cycles do not deny change. They contextualize it. They remind us that growth without release becomes pressure, and pressure without release becomes fracture. The pattern does not oppose progress. It limits it. There is comfort in this if one allows it. To see history as a rhythm rather than a race is to release the burden of exceptionality. We are not required to escape the pattern. We are required to move with it, to recognize when expansion has reached its threshold, to sense when consolidation is wiser than accumulation. This is not regression. It is attunement. The pattern also reframes collapse. Collapse is not always destruction. Often it is redistribution. People disperse. Knowledge fragments. Techniques survive in altered forms. What appears as loss at one scale becomes continuity at another. Seeds carried by wind do not preserve the forest, but they preserve the possibility of forest. Civilizations too scatter themselves when concentrated forms can no longer hold. You can feel this pattern in your own body. Periods of intensity followed by fatigue. Focus followed by drift. Inhale followed by exhale. To deny the exhale is to suffocate. Cultures that deny it exhaust themselves. The pattern is not moral. It does not reward or punish. It balances. When historians ignore this, they mistake endpoints for failures. They speak of decline, decay, fall. Geology uses different language. It speaks of transition phase, change, reconfiguration. Stone does not mourn its previous shape. It becomes something else under pressure. The pattern invites the same humility from us. At night, this understanding feels closer. The world quiets. Linear time loosens its grip. Thoughts wander backward and forward without urgency. In this state, it becomes easier to sense that we are participating in something far older than our current arrangements. The lost civilization is not behind us. It is beneath us, supporting the ground we stand on, shaping the contours of our present, whether we acknowledge it or not. The pattern continues whether we name it or not. Awareness does not stop it, but awareness can soften its edges. It can turn collapse into descent rather than free fall. It can transform loss into shedding. The civilizations that endure longest are not those that escape the cycle, but those that learn to move gently within it. As this chapter closes, the pattern does not resolve into a lesson. It settles into recognition. History is not a ladder leaning toward the future. It is a tide advancing and retreating, carrying traces of every shore it has touched. And like all tides, it asks only one thing of those who live within its reach: to notice when the water is rising and when it is time to let it go back out again. Warnings rarely arrive as alarms. They emerge as changes in texture and timing in the quiet agreements between systems that once worked smoothly together. Long before collapse becomes visible, before stories fracture and structures fail, the land begins to speak differently. Rain arrives late. Soil hardens where it once breathed. Animals alter their routes. None of these signals declare disaster. They whisper adjustment, and civilizations that endure are those that learn how to listen while the volume is still low. In the deep record, warnings appear first in the margins. The core continues to function, even thrive, while the edges grow unstable. Fields at the periphery yield less. Distant trade partners grow unreliable. Maintenance takes longer. Repairs become improvisations. These are not failures yet. They are indicators of rising friction. Like tectonic plates slowing before a quake, systems resist before they rupture. Geology teaches this patience. Stress accumulates invisibly. Pressure builds where surfaces lock together. For long periods, nothing seems to change. Then suddenly energy releases. But the release is not the warning. It is the outcome of ignored signals. The warning existed in the silence before movement, in the stillness that felt permanent. The lost civilization's warnings were written into pollen grains and animal bones, into sediment layers and toolware. Crops shifted subtly toward hardier varieties. Younger animals appeared more frequently in the refuse piles. Storage vessels grew larger, then more numerous. These adjustments were rational responses to strain. They show intelligence, not blindness. But intelligence alone does not guarantee survival. Timing matters more. Social systems register warnings differently. Cooperation begins to require reinforcement. Rituals grow heavier, more frequent, as if meaning itself must compensate for instability elsewhere. Conflict does not explode immediately. It simmers. Small disputes linger longer. Trust thins. Defensive measures appear not as militarization but as caution. Walls are repaired more carefully. Entry points narrow. The warning is not violence. It is vigilance. The most dangerous warnings are those that can be explained away. A bad harvest becomes weather. A dry year becomes chance. A failed alliance becomes politics. Each explanation is reasonable in isolation. Together they form a pattern of denial supported by plausibility. Humans excel at this. We prefer narratives that preserve continuity. We adapt stories faster than structures. In environmental systems, warnings often take the form of thresholds. Soil loses fertility gradually until it does not. Rivers silt slowly until channels clog. Forests thin incrementally until root networks fail. These transitions feel sudden only because perception lags behind process. The warning phase is long, quiet, and deeply uncomfortable because it requires change without certainty. For ancient people, responding to warnings was constrained by knowledge and tools. But it was also constrained by attachment. Leaving fertile land, abandoning ancestral ground, breaking rituals tied to specific places carried spiritual cost. The warning forced a choice between continuity of meaning and continuity of life. Such choices are never clean. Climate compounds this dilemma. Shifts rarely announce themselves within a single lifetime. A few decades of variability blur into noise. Elders recall stability. Youth adapt to scarcity as normal. Memory fragments. Consensus dissolves. The warning becomes generationally asymmetric. Those with authority remember a different world. Those without authority live in the new one. In the archaeological record, this misalignment is visible. Older architectural forms persist alongside new improvisations. Sacred spaces are maintained even as surrounding infrastructure decays. Resources are diverted to preserve symbols while systems that support daily survival strain. This is not irrational. It reflects a belief that meaning stabilizes reality. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it delays necessary movement. The warning is also biological. Bodies respond before institutions. Signs of malnutrition appear first in children. Immune stress increases. Healing slows. These signals are intimate, easily hidden, often ignored until they aggregate into demographic change. By the time mortality shifts noticeably, the warning phase has already passed. One of the most telling warnings is simplification. When society is under pressure, they simplify by necessity. This can be adaptive. But when simplification accelerates beyond intention, when diversity collapses into monoculture, resilience diminishes. Systems lose redundancy. Failure in one component propagates faster. The warning is not scarcity itself. It is fragility. Trade networks serve as early indicators. When distant exchange falters, it signals more than economic trouble. It reflects declining trust, rising risk, or parallel stress elsewhere. Long-distance trade is optional in survival terms. Its contraction is rational under pressure. But it also removes buffers. Specialized regions become vulnerable. Interdependence turns into liability. In the deep past, warnings were local but interconnected. A drought here altered migration there. A flood upstream reshaped entire valleys. No civilization experienced warning in isolation. The Earth operates as a coupled system. Stress in one region transmits through climate ecology and human movement. The warning spreads quietly. Modern societies often misread warnings because they expect novelty. They look for unprecedented signals, but warnings repeat. They rhyme across epochs. Soil depletion looks like soil depletion whether measured in pollen or satellites. Social fragmentation feels similar whether expressed through oral disputes or digital polarization. The scale changes. The pattern does not. The lost civilization received its warnings gradually layered over generations. There was no single moment when disaster was obvious. Instead, there were thousands of small decisions, each reasonable, each insufficient. Adaptation occurred, but adaptation without transformation only postpones reckoning. The warning phase asks not for adjustment, but for reconfiguration. This is the hardest demand. Reconfiguration requires releasing identity. It requires admitting that systems built with care may no longer fit the conditions that sustained them. It requires choosing loss now to prevent greater loss later. Few societies, ancient or modern, make this choice easily. At night, warnings feel clearer. When activity slows, when noise recedes, patterns emerge. The mind recognizes imbalance the way the body recognizes fever. Unease without explanation. Restlessness without cause. These sensations are informational. They precede articulation. Civilizations, too, experience this phase. Anxiety before analysis. Tension before theory. The warning does not promise catastrophe. It offers an opportunity. It invites change while options remain. It speaks softly because it respects autonomy. It does not force. It waits. When ignored long enough, it transforms into consequence, not as punishment, but as physics. Understanding this reframes the past. The disappearance of the lost civilization was not sudden. It was preceded by decades, perhaps centuries of signals. The tragedy is not that warnings existed. It is that they were insufficiently aligned with capacity to respond. For us, the warning is not historical. It is present. It appears in the same forms, scale differently. Climate variability, resource stress, social polarization, infrastructure fragility, each can be explained away. Together they form a familiar pattern. Recognition does not guarantee response, but without recognition, response is impossible. The warning asks for humility. It asks us to see ourselves as participants in cycles rather than exceptions to them. It asks us to listen not for catastrophe but for imbalance. It asks us to slow enough to notice when systems whisper before they break. As this chapter settles, the warning does not resolve into instruction. It lingers as awareness, a low-frequency signal beneath daily noise. It does not tell us what will happen. It tells us what is happening now. And like all warnings, its value depends not on its clarity, but on our willingness to change while there is still time. The return does not arrive with footsteps or banners. It comes the way night returns to a landscape that has never truly forgotten darkness quietly, without urgency settling into the low places first. Long after the houses were abandoned and the ladders pulled from the roofs, long after ash sealed the hearths, and dust erased the paths between walls, the land continued to breathe. Stone cooled, soil shifted, roots pushed into fractures where human hands once pressed clay into form. What we call disappearance is often only dispersion, a thinning rather than an ending. The people did not evaporate into myth. They became motion. They carried the city outward in their bodies in habits learned so deeply they no longer felt like choices. How to store grain, how to plaster walls, how to orient a room toward warmth and light. Memory travels most efficiently when it pretends to be instinct. Imagine them leaving at dawn, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small departures stretched across seasons. A family here, a cluster there, following water lines, grazing paths, familiar stars. The city did not fall, it unravelled. Like fabric worn thin by use, it loosened until the pattern could no longer hold itself together. Yet every thread still existed somewhere beyond the original weave. Geology understands this kind of return well. A mountain does not vanish when erosion lowers its peak. It spreads. Its minerals travel downstream, becoming soil, becoming delta, becoming the quiet fertility of plains, far from the place of origin. What once stood upright becomes useful elsewhere. This is not loss. This is redistribution. Gravity is memory insisting on movement. In later centuries, in places far from this buried city, people built homes with walls pressed tightly together. They shared heat. They shared smoke. They stored their dead beneath floors. Archaeologists debate diffusion, coincidence, parallel development, but the land itself offers a simpler answer. Ideas like sediments move with pressure. They flow along paths of least resistance. They accumulate where conditions allow them to rest. The return is subtle because it does not announce itself as inheritance. No one says we're doing this because our ancestors lived in roof entry houses 9 millennia ago. Instead, hands repeat gestures that feel correct. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten. This is how deep time works. It bypasses explanation and settles directly into behavior. Even today, when you walk through dense cities where walls touch and neighbors share sound and warmth, you're standing inside an echo chamber built by people who understood proximity as protection rather than threat. When communities gather without monuments, without kings, without obvious hierarchy, they are reenacting an old experiment, not copying it, remembering it without knowing they remember. The stars played their role as well. Those who left did not lose the sky. The same constellations followed them across valleys and ridges, rose and set with patient indifference. Orientation travels well when it is celestial. The rhythm of seasons, the angle of light, the long memory of solstice and equinox carried continuity when architecture could not. Sky is the most portable archive humanity has ever used. Over generations, names changed, stories blurred, specific origins dissolved into generalized ancestry. But practices remained anchored to something older than language. How close is too close? How much to store? When to leave a place before it breaks you? These lessons were not written. They were absorbed. Erosion teaches by repetition, not instruction. The return is not the rebuilding of the same city in the same place. That would be too literal, too fragile. Instead, it is the resurfacing of principles when conditions align. Dense living reappears when land allows it. Ritual returns when uncertainty demands structure. Shared labor reemerges when survival exceeds individual capacity. The past does not come back as ruins. It comes back as solutions. Sometimes it comes back as warnings embedded in discomfort. a sense that growth has gone too far, that storage has become hoarding, that proximity has tipped into strain. The ancestors knew this feeling. They left not because they failed, but because staying would have turned success into collapse. Departure was adaptation. Movement was wisdom. We often romanticize permanence, but geology does not. Rivers that refuse to move carve canyons until they destroy themselves. Forests that never burn choke on their own density. Civilizations that do not migrate physically or conceptually become brittle. The people of this city understood something elemental. Stability is a phase, not a destination. The return is happening now in ways that feel oddly familiar. Communities experiment with shared space again. People look to cycles instead of progress. There is renewed interest in living smaller, closer, slower, not because the past was perfect, but because it survived long enough to leave instructions written in soil and bone. These are not trends, they are recurrences. When archaeologists uncover the city brushing dust from walls that have not seen light in 9,000 years, they are not discovering something dead. They are meeting something dormant. The stones do not speak, but they listen. They absorb interpretation the way sediment absorbs pressure. Each generation hears a slightly different message shaped by its own weight. The return is also personal. When you feel drawn to quiet spaces, to routines that ground rather than accelerate, you're responding to a frequency older than modern timekeeping. The body recognizes environments that evolved alongside it. The nervous system relaxes in conditions it has known before, even if consciousness cannot place them. Sleep itself is a form of return. Every night awareness withdraws from the present and drifts toward a deeper archive. The mind sheds linearity. Memory becomes landscape. Dreams are not random. They are sedimentary, layered with traces from many eras at once. In sleep, the individual loosens and the species speaks more clearly. This civilization did not disappear because it failed to matter. It disappeared because it succeeded long enough to become unnecessary as a fixed location. Its real structure was never the walls or the ladders. It was the rhythm of adaptation. When that rhythm demanded motion, they moved. When it demanded silence, they faded. The return then is not about rebuilding what was lost. It is about recognizing what never left. The city still exists as potential, waiting in the way humans gather, share, withdraw, and begin again. It exists in the quiet confidence that endings are not opposites of beginnings, but they're prerequisites. As night settles again over the land, long shadows stretch across foundations that once held warmth and breath. The stones are cool now. Cool. They do not mourn. They have seen enough cycles to know that absence is temporary. Everything that disperses eventually recombines, though never in the same shape. That is not tragedy. That is deep time keeping its promise. The return is already underway. It always is. Return is a misleading word. It suggests reversal, a retracing of steps, a movement backward along a path that still exists. But in deep time, paths do not remain intact. They erode, fold, subduct, and vanish. What returns is not a place or a people, but a condition, a familiar pressure, a recognizable alignment of forces. Gravity remembers even when surfaces change. The return begins quietly, as it always does. Not with collapse or revelation, but with a feeling that the systems holding life together are becoming slightly louder, slightly tighter. Harvests still arrive, but later. Weather still follows seasons, but with hesitation. Structures still function, but require more maintenance, more energy, more explanation. Nothing is broken. Everything is strained. This is how cycles announce themselves. For the lost civilization, the return likely felt like subtle unease rather than fear, a sense that inherited knowledge no longer fit the land quite as well as it once had, that rituals still carried meaning but less certainty, that the old rhythms required adjustment. Earth does not revoke its permissions abruptly, it renegotiates. In this phase, familiarity becomes dangerous. People trust patterns that once held even as the ground beneath them shifts. Wells run a little deeper each generation. Fields require more tending. Trade becomes less reliable. These are not signs of doom. They are invitations to change. But invitations can be declined. Return is not punishment. It is feedback. the planet responding to density extraction imbalance and time, not with intention but with consequence. The Earth does not know humans, it knows weight, heat, water and pressure. Civilizations rise when their arrangements align with those forces. They waver when alignment drifts. There is comfort in recognizing this. It removes moral drama. The lost civilization did not fail. It reached the edge of a cycle and encountered conditions that demanded transformation. What feels like an ending from one angle is a turning from another. Stone does not mourn the mountain it once was. It becomes riverbed, sand, sediment. Purpose dissolves into process. Return also carries recognition. When pressures reappear, so do old solutions. People rediscover ways of living closer together, sharing resources, reducing exposure. They simplify not because simplicity is virtuous, but because complexity becomes expensive. Complexity requires stability. When stability fades, elegance returns. This is visible across eras. After empires, thin villages form. After networks collapse, local knowledge resurfaces. After abundance contracts, memory becomes currency. These movements are not regressions, they are recalibrations. The return does not ask us to rebuild the past. It asks us to remember why certain forms existed at all. In the archaeological record, return is subtle. You see it in reused stones, in old foundations repurposed for new walls, in sacred sites revisited centuries later by people who no longer know their original names. The land remembers where attention once gathered. Humans are drawn back to those nodes instinctively as if sensing residual alignment. For the lost civilization, return may have been incomplete. They dispersed before the full cycle closed. Their knowledge scattered into neighbouring cultures, diluted, recontextualized. What returned was not their city, but fragments of their logic, a way of organizing space, a tolerance for density without hierarchy, a comfort with impermanence. Return also happens inward. Individuals feel it as déjà vu, as longing without object. A sense that something about modern life is misaligned, too loud, too fast, too brittle. These sensations are often dismissed as nostalgia or anxiety, but they may be biological memory responding to environmental cues, the body noticing patterns before the mind can name them. Deep time does not communicate in words, it communicates in thresholds. When enough variables align, a response emerges. The return is not a warning bell, it is a pressure gradient. You feel it when maintaining the status quo requires more effort than adjusting to change. This is where the lost civilization becomes relevant again, not as a model to copy, but as a mirror. They encountered a return and responded by loosening rather than tightening, by dispersing rather than defending at all costs, by carrying knowledge lightly instead of anchoring it entirely to place. This choice left fewer ruins but more continuity. From a modern perspective, this is difficult to accept. We equate survival with preservation of structure. They may have equated survival with preservation of life. The difference is profound. One resists change until fracture. The other yields early conserving energy. Return then is not about going back. It is about arriving again at questions that never disappear. How dense can we live without harm? How much can we extract without imbalance? How complex can systems become before they require more stability than the Earth can provide? These questions are not answered once. They cycle. Each generation answers them differently with different tools under different skies. The return ensures they are never settled permanently. Stability is temporary. Adaptation is continuous. There is something deeply human in this. We are not creatures of completion. We are creatures of adjustment. Our civilizations are not monuments to permanence, but experiments in arrangement. Some last centuries, some last millennia. None escape gravity. The return does not erase progress. It reframes it. Knowledge accumulates, but context shifts. Techniques persist, but purposes change. What survives is not form, but principle. Not cities, but relationships. Not names, but habits. As night deepens, the idea of return becomes less threatening. In darkness, cycles feel natural. Sleep itself is a daily return. Consciousness dissolves and reforms without fear. The body trusts the rhythm because it has repeated it thousands of times. Civilizations too sleep. They exhale. They release what they can no longer carry. The lost civilization entered that phase gently without spectacle. Their return was quiet, dispersed, incomplete, and therefore successful in its own way. What remains is not instruction, but resonance, a sense that endings need not be violent, that collapse is not the only language of change, that leaving can be an act of intelligence. The return is already happening always. The question is not whether we will encounter it, but how we will recognize it when it arrives. There is a softness to this understanding once it settles. The return no longer feels like a shadow falling across the future, but like a tide obeying a lunar pull older than fear. What comes back is not loss, but proportion. A reminder of scale, of how small human urgency is compared to geological patience, and how resilient life becomes when it stops pretending to be permanent. In this light, the lost civilization appears less as a tragedy and more as a completed breath. Inhale, growth density meaning complexity. Exhale, dispersal, forgetting, redistribution, quiet. Both movements are necessary. Neither is failure. We suffer when we cling to one and deny the other. Earth never does. It cycles without preference. Perhaps this is why their disappearance feels strangely gentle in the record. No charred horizons. No final screams etched into stone. Just absence. Just space reclaiming itself. Just memory thinning into soil. It is not that they were spared hardship, but that they understood when to stop pressing against the limits of their world. As listeners, as sleepers, as inhabitants of another crowded age, we are not being asked to repeat their choices, only to notice the rhythm beneath ours, to feel when effort becomes strain, when maintenance becomes desperation, when growth stops being nourishment and starts becoming weight. The return is not ahead of us. It is beneath us already humming patient as gravity waiting for acknowledgement. Reflection begins where effort ends, not because answers have been found, but because the need to chase them loosens its grip. In deep time, understanding does not arrive as certainty. It arrives as acceptance, the kind that settles slowly like dust after a long disturbance, coating every surface evenly until nothing sharp remains. The lost civilization no longer asks to be solved. It asks to be held in the mind without urgency, to be acknowledged as something that existed, fully responded intelligently to its conditions, and then released itself back into the larger systems that made it possible in the first place. Reflection is not analysis. It is rest. When you step back far enough, the city becomes less distinct. Individual houses blur into texture. Timelines compress. What once felt like dramatic rise and fall softens into a gentle oscillation. Growth, balance, strain, release. These are not events. They are states. They recur the way seasons do indifferent to names. In this distance, judgment loses relevance. There is no triumph in survival, and no shame in disappearance. The earth keeps no score. It records only presence and absence, pressure and relief. Civilizations are temporary arrangements of matter and behavior, held together by energy borrowed from the environment. When that energy becomes too costly to maintain arrangements, dissolve. This is not pessimism, it is clarity. The same clarity that allows a river to change course without apology, or a forest to burn and return. Reflection reveals that impermanence is not a flaw in systems. It is their safety valve. Without it, everything breaks catastrophically. With it, change becomes survivable. For the people who lived within that ancient city, reflection likely arrived quietly in daily decisions, whether to repair a wall or let it stand unfinished, whether to invest another season in a field or follow water elsewhere, whether to teach children the old ways or prepare them for different ground. These moments rarely feel historic when lived. They feel practical, necessary, ordinary. What we inherit from them is not instruction, but permission. Permission to release the idea that continuity must look like preservation. Permission to accept that some knowledge is meant to travel lightly unburdened by monuments. Permission to understand that leaving does not negate meaning, it completes it. Reflection also softens our relationship with time. Modern life insists on speed, accumulation, acceleration. Deep time offers a counterweight. It reminds us that most processes worth trusting operate below the threshold of immediacy. Soil forms slowly, Habits settle gradually. Cultural wisdom accrues not through declarations but through repetition. When you reflect long enough, anxiety changes shape. It no longer asks, how do we prevent collapse? It asks, how do we make transitions less violent? How do we design systems that can shrink without shattering? How do we teach flexibility as a form of intelligence rather than weakness? The lost civilizations suggest one answer. They did not build for eternity. They built for relevance. Their architecture served life as it existed, then not as they imagined it should forever remain. When relevance faded, structures were allowed to dissolve. This restraint left fewer ruins, but it may have spared lives. Reflection reveals the difference between legacy and trace. Legacy demands remembrance. Trace accepts diffusion. A legacy insists on being known. A trace is content to be felt. The city left traces in construction techniques, in social tolerance for density, in ritual intimacy, in the idea that complex societies do not require kings. These traces surface in unexpected places, in cooperative housing, in shared labour systems, in the quiet discomfort people feel with excessive hierarchy. In the recurring human impulse to gather closely during uncertainty, rather than isolate completely, the past persists where it remains useful. There is also humility in reflection, the recognition that our interpretations are provisional, that future generations will read our remains through lenses we cannot imagine, that what we consider essential may look strange or irrelevant to those who come after. This awareness does not invalidate effort, it contextualizes it. Reflection allows grief without despair. There is sadness in knowing that so much was lost, stories untold, names forgotten, skills abandoned. But there is also peace in understanding that loss is not waste. Matter rearranges, knowledge fragments, influence disperses. Nothing truly disappears, it only changes scale. As listeners drifting towards sleep reflection, aligns naturally with the body's own rhythms, muscles release, breath deepens, consciousness loosens its grip on linear thought. The mind begins to think the way geology does in layers rather than sequences. Memory becomes landscape. In this state, the lost civilization feels less distant, not because it returns vividly, but because it dissolves into the same background hum that supports all human experience. Hunger, shelter, belonging, meaning. These constants persist across eras. The specifics change, the questions remain. Reflection also invites compassion toward ourselves, toward the limitations of our own systems, toward the fragility we often try to hide beneath confidence and scale. Recognizing that others face similar pressures and made imperfect choices softens the urge to demand perfection from the present. The final lesson is not cautionary, it is gentle. It says that civilizations are not meant to last forever in fixed form. They are meant to explore possibilities, to test arrangements, to leave behind whatever proves adaptable. Completion is not failure, it is closure. As the night deepens and thought thins into quiet awareness, the city rests again where it has always rested, beneath soil, beneath time, beneath the need to be explained. It does not ask to be remembered loudly. It asks only that its existence widen our sense of what is possible and what is acceptable to release. Somewhere beneath the ground walls continue to cool. Plaster returns to dust. Stone listens to pressure. Roots trace familiar paths through forgotten rooms. The earth incorporates the city the way it incorporates everything else patiently without distinction, and somewhere above you rest, breathing, drifting, participating in the same cycle without effort. This too is part of the story, not an ending, but a pause, a moment of stillness between movements. Reflection completes the arc not by answering every question, but by allowing them to settle. The lost civilization remains lost, and yet nothing essential has gone missing. There is comfort in ending this way without resolution, without insistence. The mind does not need to close every loop to feel whole. Sometimes wholeness arrives when we stop tightening our grip on meaning and allow it to rest where it falls. Deep time prefers this softness. It carries truths best when they are not forced into sharp shapes. As you linger here between wakefulness and sleep, notice how reflection asks nothing of you. You do not need to remember dates or causes or outcomes. You only need to feel the quiet continuity that links breath to soil, thought to stone presence to absence. This connection does not demand belief. It exists whether it is named or not. The story recedes now not into darkness but into depth. Like sediment settling at the bottom of clear water, it becomes part of the foundation rather than the surface. Tomorrow the world will resume its noise and urgency, but something underneath will remain slower, steadier, less reactive. That is what reflection leaves behind. Not answers, but balance. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The long path through dust and stone, through memory and forgetting, has gently narrowed into stillness. Nothing more needs to be carried forward. The weight of history can be set down here where the ground is cool and steady, and where effort finally loosens its hold. You've listened to thousands of words, but they were never meant to be kept intact. This journey does not ask to be remembered line by line or understood as a sequence. It has already done its work, slipping past attention, and settling into deeper layers like sediment finding its place beneath calm water. What mattered has been absorbed without effort. In the end, traveller, it is all right to not understand. Understanding is sharp and wakeful, and tonight asks for softness instead. Meaning does not vanish when it is released. It simply changes state, becoming something quieter, something that no longer demands explanation in order to exist. Let gravity hold you. Let the questions fade. Allow the body to sink into its own ancient knowledge, the instinct that knows how to rest when the day has fully exhaled. Breath slows. Muscles yield. Thought thins into gentle awareness, then drifts beyond even that. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only observed. Tonight the universe whispers again. Sleep, traveller. The cosmos will keep watch.